The Senate Armed Services Committee wants to give the Pentagon a $740 billion defense budget. The committee is proposing spending more on Army combat vehicles. Billy Fabian is adjunct senior fellow for the defense program at the Center for New American Security. He's also senior analyst at Govini. He's writing about the U.S. Army's new Iron Triangle in Defense News. Thanks for joining me, Billy. Let's start by talking about the Iron Triangle that you describe in your article. What is it?
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So the new Iron Triangle is a set of missions or challenges that the Army believes it needs to be prepared for. That'll be very difficult for the Army to prepare for all three simultaneously. So they're first to deter and, if necessary, defeat Russian aggression along NATO's eastern frontier, particularly in the Baltic region. Second is to support the larger joint force in deterring and, if necessary, defeating Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific, in Taiwan, the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And the third is what I call hedging for everything else. So we have other threats beyond China and Russia, war on the North Korean Peninsula, unforeseen contingencies, supporting the civilian authorities in responding to either homeland defense or natural disasters like COVID-19, and competing day to day with China and Russia. So a whole set of other missions that fall under this challenge beyond preparing for high intensity war with China and Russia.
You note that obviously this would be a pretty full plate no matter what, but that the budget maybe has not been as focused on the Army. How does sort of the budget process so far shape how you're thinking about this Iron Triangle?
Yeah, so there's a belief that that the Army will be the bill payer for air and naval modernization, with even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, who's an Army general, predicting that there'll be a bloodletting for the Army. We didn't see that materialize in the FY22 budget request, but the belief is that it's still coming. So even under a flat budget, it would be difficult to build a force that's fully prepared for all these challenges, because they each have their own implications for doctrine, force structure, modernization of capabilities, posture, and readiness. But under a shrinking budget, it'll be even more difficult to balance all the challenges.
What do you recommend? How should the Army prioritize these kind of competing needs?
Well, I think it's important to point out that it's reasonable for the Army to be concerned about all three of these challenges. There's been suggestions out there that the Army should just focus on Russia, become the Europe force, and not worry about anything else. But I don't think that's realistic. The Army, even if it doesn't provide long-range fires in a China scenario, which is something that's being debated right now, it will still have a role supporting the joint force with logistics, medical care, land-based air defenses, things like that. And I think it's reasonable to hedge for other contingencies, because even if the Department of Defense says China and Russia are the priority, ultimately the DoD doesn't get to decide where and when we operate, right? That's up to our civilian leaders. So the Army needs to be prepared to give political leaders options, right? So it's reasonable that they prepare for all three. I think it's the way they really need to think about it is about what are sort of no-fail missions and where they might be able to take risk. I think the challenge will fall hardest in the modernization. That's where the squeezes in the modernization budget will be the most significant. But I think what the Army really needs to do is open the aperture beyond modernization and bring things like force structure and end strength into the conversation, and think about where they can take risk there, perhaps to fund modernization, and then maybe use the reserve component like the National Guard in sort of creative ways to buy down the risk in the places where maybe it made cuts to sort of active duty end strength. Fortunately, this is sort of why Futures Command, U.S. Army Futures Command, was created, was to grapple with these tough issues. And I think they just need to prioritize and to think hard about risk.
You note the Army obviously can't just make these decisions itself. How do you think Congress would feel about bringing end strength back into the conversation, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be political considerations that you have to deal with. I mean, you've seen even with this budget where the Army made the choice to to pay for long-term modernization, to sort of reduce the amount of money it was putting towards upgrading legacy systems to improve its capability in sort of the near term. And Congress seems to be willing to put some of that money back into the budget to pay for those upgrades. So I think there's always going to be the issue of working with Congress. I think what's important though is for the Army to take a good hard look at itself from what's best from a strategic and operational perspective, and then at least bring that forward to Congress and make their case for why this is necessary to make these hard trades. It may not work, right? Congress may overrule them, but I think that's in the best interest of the nation to lay out the hard choices that need to be made.
Thanks, Billy. Appreciate your time.
No, thank you. Pleasure being here.